So in 2010, the New York Times published a disturbing series of news stories that interviewed former students of St. John's School for the Deaf, a Catholic school near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The articles revealed horrifying details about Father Lawrence Murphy, a priest who served as chaplain and then director of that school from 1950 until 1974. He was a hearing man who was fluent in sign language, and Murphy sexually abused 200 or more deaf children during his tenure at St. John's. A 2012 film called Mea Maxima Culpa shares the students' stories and describes their brave efforts to bring Murphy to account. They share how they observed that Father Murphy would single out deaf students with hearing parents so that children would be less likely to tell their parents what was happening. In the film, Terry Kohut, a deaf survivor who attended the school from 1960 to 1969, describes through an interpreter the first time Father Murphy sexually abused him as a child. He said, "I felt sick and confused. Why would a priest do that to me? Is this supposed to be okay? Did I do something wrong? I didn't know. After it happened, I just left and kept it to myself." Father Murphy's victims did begin in the 1950s to speak up, telling other priests about the abuse. In the 1970s, former students of the school shared their stories with police and archdiocesan officials, but this did not lead to action. Father Murphy remained in his role at St. John's until 1974, when he departed on what was described as sick leave. He eventually went on to work in parish ministry in northern Wisconsin and remained a priest until his death in 1998. The Murphy case is a painful illustration of some of the particular risks to deaf people in Catholic settings around the world. Today, we welcome two guests who will help us understand more about the intersection of deafness and abuse in the Catholic Church. So first, I'm honored to introduce Laureen Lynch-Ryan, who's joining us today from Maryland. Laureen is the coordinator of Deaf Ministry for the Office of Deaf and Disability Ministry for the Archdiocese of Washington. She's held this position since 2009. Her work includes providing faith formation for deaf children and adults at St. Francis Deaf Catholic Church in Washington, D.C., training liturgical ASL interpreters, and planning for deaf participation in archdiocesan-wide events. She graduated from Gallaudet University with a master's in social work. Gallaudet is a liberal arts college established for deaf students. Laureen is on the board of the Deaf Catholic Youth Initiative for the Americas, where she helps lead Encuentros, a camp for Spanish-speaking deaf young adults in Central and Latin America. She has also worked as a longtime advocate and counselor for deaf women who have experienced sexual assault. Last year, Laureen and her fellow panelists, Maryann Barth, gave an important talk about sexual abuse among deaf Catholics for the International Safeguarding Conference at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Laureen, we're honored to have you here today. Let's now turn to Maryann Barth, who lives in the state of Kentucky. Maryann is a deaf professional educator and counselor who currently works with high school students at the St. Rita School for the Deaf in Cincinnati, Ohio, the only remaining Catholic school for the deaf in the United States. Maryann previously worked in the deaf ministry for the Diocese of Covington, which unfortunately shuttered due to budget cuts. Maryann also earned a master's in counseling from Gallaudet University. Since 2001, she's served on the board of the Deaf Catholic Youth Initiative for the Americas, and she too helps lead Encuentros, the camp for Spanish-speaking deaf young adults. Maryann explains that participants in Encuentros will often disclose that they've been abused at some point in their lives, in part because this is the first time they've been able to communicate with others and feel safe to share this information. Maryann, we're very glad to learn from you today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're joined today by two skilled ASL interpreters, Sue and Lizzie. Sue and Lizzie, we're grateful for your assistance today. So now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator of this discussion, Christian Crocus, an awake volunteer and a theology professor from Scranton, Pennsylvania. All set, Christian?
Okay, thank you very much, Mary, and good afternoon to everyone. It is my privilege and my honor to moderate today's courageous conversation with our esteemed speakers, Laureen and Maryann. So let's get started. I will begin with a very general question. What are some of the main reasons that deaf Catholics have been at particular risk for abuse in the church? And then, a little more specifically, if you could say something about the factors of language deprivation and language disfluency, and maybe teach us about the distinction between those terms. That would be good. So maybe I'll ask Maryann if you could start, and then Laureen, you jump in. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with all of you today to participate in this. Thanks so much for having us. We as deaf people are a varied group. We're very diverse, but we share a same language. Now, language skills vary on a number of factors. First factor is where somebody attends school, whether they depend on their parents for communication or the role of interpreters. I work a lot with statistics, and less than 30% of parents or caregivers sign. So if you think about that number, less than 30%, if we have 100 parents or caregivers, less than 30 of them are using sign language to communicate with their kids. So that leads to lack of communication with their children, which leads to language deprivation and children being behind in their educational access. Psychologically, behavior-wise, and mentally and emotionally, all of that is impacted by lack of communication and language deprivation. So we do see that. For those who are deaf, those who are deaf-blind, and those who are deaf with additional disabilities, language deprivation is very common. And for those individuals, they do not function typically as our children who grow up who are hearing. And by typical, I mean it doesn't mean that they're ignorant or incapable of learning. It just means that they haven't had access to language and information, which leads them to be behind, stunted in a lot of their areas of growth and well-being. Language deformation, they may have some signs, but they may not be able to um, have fluent language. Their language may have gaps. As a result of that language deprivation, they can't make connections between the words that they know and make meaning. That leads to disfluency, and disfluency is a result of language deprivation, and that impacts deaf children as well as deaf adults. If a child experiences language deprivation and they're trying to catch up to for them to be able to understand fluent language may or may not happen. It's challenging for children who have grown up with language deprivation to see them be fully capable. You can see the disfluency and how it affects their lives as adults. They may have experienced different kinds of abuse. One of them may be sexual abuse. In the intro, they talked about Father Murphy. This is the sign name for Father Murphy. He became very adept at sign language. He was a very fluent signer. And for children, they're always hungry for communication and connection. Any child is. So if their parents did not sign, they actually had an opportunity to communicate with somebody in this priest who was fluent in sign language. And that was a huge connection for many children. Again, children, as they're growing up to develop the language skills, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they may have that language deprivation that impacts them the rest of their life. Does that answer the question, Christian?
That's excellent. Yeah, thank you very much, Maryann. Yeah. Laureen, is there anything you would add to what Maryann said?
Yes, to what Maryann described, all of that has been very clear. When you encounter a deaf person who is able to sign, sometimes their sign may not be, let's say, as clear as fluent sign language. There may be gaps in their signs. So sometimes their signs may not be clear as a result. So it's not fluent American Sign Language. There may be gaps in their signs. Some of their signs may be home signs, sign language that's developed at home. They might use visual objects, such as referencing or pointing, meaning that they have some knowledge and some understanding, but they're not able to fluently express that in a full, proper sentence. So some of that language, you will see that happening in some language disfluency as well. You will also be able to see a person perhaps sign different than somebody who is fluent or skilled in American Sign Language, such as Maryann. Their signs may not be the same or line up with one another. You may also see that in the people that you work with. Maryann.
Please, Maryann, please.
Just to add, ASL and English are not the same grammatically. So sometimes people think, well, signing fluent means it's English word order and it follows that grammar structure, but in fact, it does not. ASL is a language in and of itself. It has its own syntax, its own grammatical rules, and it's different than English grammar and English words sentence structure. We can discuss it later on, but if you give a deaf person a piece of paper to read and you write back and forth, it may or may not be effective because of that, because the English structure for grammar is different than ASL. It's just like if we were to go to Russia and we were trying to write back and forth, and I would write something in English and give it to a Russian speaking person, it may not make sense. So that's a similar example. So just people are aware that the languages are different, and that's additional factor when it comes to language deprivation and language disfluency. If parents or caregivers are signers or communicate with their kids, again, remember the statistic of less than 30%, many of them may not be signing ASL. They may be signing some English word orders, but using signs to do so. So their fluency is also not there.
Thank you. That's really illuminating. I latched on to something you said, Maryann, about the fluency of Father Murphy, who was mentioned in the introduction by Mary, and how deaf children may be hungry for communication with, and maybe even especially with an adult. And I hadn't thought about that as the place for potential grooming. And so I wondered if either Maryann or Laureen, if you would like to say anything more about what you have learned from that Father Murphy case. And I think especially because many people in the Awake community are from the region, and so they may be familiar with that case. So if there's anything else you think we ought to learn from that case, it would be great to share it. And then I can ask you about other cases as well. Maybe Laureen, you could start this time.
I would say Maryann maybe would have a better answer. We are reminded, I mean, it is a landmark case, the case with Father Murphy and what happened at the School for the Deaf. But that is not the only case where that happened. It happens all over the world. In Argentina, it's happened in Chile, Canada, Ireland, and some few in the Americas as well, but a smaller number relative. I mean, Murphy's is the largest case that we have of victims, over 200, from what I'm aware. So this is not the only case where that's happened. It's not only Milwaukee that this has taken place. But Maryann, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
Please.
Thank you. And thank you, Laureen. Yes, the Father Murphy case was not an isolated event. Unfortunately, it has happened in various places in the United States as well as all over the world, and many of them are unreported or underreported, and may or may not, most likely, have not gone to any criminal or judicial proceedings. Going back to the concept of grooming, we sign grooming as how I just showed it, but it's usually an adult who is fluent in sign language, but also takes steps to progressively build that relationship in grooming behavior. So first, for a deaf person, this applies for deaf, blind, those who are deaf blind that may use tactile communication, like hand over hand communication to understand, or those who are deaf with additional disabilities. They try to, like, oh, let's come and have fun together. It's okay. Your parents don't understand you. Come be with me. And they kind of accompany the child. And in that accompaniment, they may isolate the child. And it usually builds over time as they gain the trust of the child or the vulnerable person. And they say, "Oh yes, you are a special person. You're a deaf person. I'm a special person because I can sign with you. This is going to be our secret. This is going to be our special communication, our special relationship." And people want to feel a sense of belonging. We're made for connection. Um, it's a human need, and often in families where there's limited or no signing, our deaf children are left to feel isolated within their own domestic unit, and they don't feel a sense of belonging in their family. And so for those, they encounter somebody that learns sign language, it becomes an opportunity. It makes them more vulnerable to be a victim of abuse by individuals who may use language as a gateway to access and isolate this child or vulnerable person. So it really, the key is access.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please, Laureen.
Yes, I would like to add to that. To what Maryann was explaining about the grooming process, at the same time within deaf culture, there's a familiarity that when deaf children grow up, they learn what touch means. So in deaf culture, there tends to be a touch of like tapping somebody on their shoulder or their forearm or waving. And there's like perhaps a lag to get somebody's attention. So in the deaf community, it is customary. Touch is customary. Likewise, deaf people are familiar with what appropriate touch is. Now, if you have predators there who use touch in a different way, an inappropriate way, to the point where that deaf child then becomes confused or disoriented, thinking, oh, this might seem like it's an okay touch. So the predator would use touch manipulatively to confuse that child between appropriate and inappropriate touch. So predators in the Murphy case have taken advantage of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can see how the issues of access and potential isolation, even within one's own family, and then the tactile nature of communication, uh, compounded by the language deprivation, would make it very confusing for the child even to understand what's happening, and potentially very confusing trying to figure out how to communicate any of that to another adult. So yeah, it was a really helpful walk through the kind of grooming that may occur. And I presume the answer to this is yes, but I'll ask anyway. Would you say that these patterns are fairly typical across those instances you mentioned in Argentina and Chile and Ireland? And would you say it's the same pattern of behaviors in those other settings?
I don't have an answer to that because I've not heard from them in other countries. But based on my experience and my work with deaf survivors, there does seem to have a common experience. Some things are similar, some things are not when it comes to their experience of abuse. But the bottom line is the same across the board. So I would imagine in other countries, they experience quite similarities to the United States as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, when we were planning this conversation and we met last week, you both mentioned that not only is sexual abuse much too common in the deaf community, but also that, and you said this again today, that it's very underreported. And I wondered if you could say a few words about what and you've already done some of this, but if you could say what some of the obstacles are to reporting for someone in the deaf community who has experienced abuse. And either one of you who would like to begin, that would be terrific. Thank you.
I'll give this one to Maryann.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. First, I just want to, start out with some numbers. Unfortunately, we do not have really good numbers of those who have experienced different types of abuse, just in the church or outside the church. The statistics, we really need statistics to help us with the research. But in 2023, within the United States, approximately 50% of deaf women had experienced sexual abuse, compared to 25% of hearing females. So in that sense, it's double for the deaf community, for deaf females. For men, it was 50%, 54% of deaf men have experienced abuse, compared to hearing men who have experienced only about 10% have experienced abuse. So the reporting situation that we experience is, why are the numbers so high? We think the numbers are actually growing because people didn't report it when it happened, and they're reporting it later. And as I mentioned, isolation, access to language, access to communication, feeling isolated and disconnected from their family. When they experience abuse of any kind, especially sexual abuse, where do they go? Who do they disclose to? And who do they share that information with? Will they be believed? There's so many layers for an individual to report. If a deaf person grows up in a home where language isn't really happening, communication may happen, but language is not the same as communication. Communication might be gesturing, like, okay, it's time to eat, and that is communication, but it's not necessarily language. So if there wasn't language in the home for them, and a person experiences sexual abuse or other types of abuse, who and how do they disclose? So one barrier is access. They don't have access to somebody that they could disclose to. Again, going back to what Laureen had mentioned, that the language disfluency is a factor. Do they have enough language to express to another person what they experienced? As Laureen mentioned, there's appropriate touch that's very, very much a part and typical in deaf culture. But then if it gets manipulated and skewed, it's hard to express what's appropriate and not appropriate touch. Again, and if it doesn't get disclosed, it will likely continue to happen, and happen more repeatedly. I'll turn it over to Laureen if she has more to add.
Please.
I would like to add, it depends on the person and their language and the barriers of communication that are there. But they might use movement to show things. They might use movement to try to express themselves more clearly. They might use props or come with me to perhaps like a different room to then show or point to a thing or to what happened to that individual to try to disclose what it is that went wrong or why their behavior is a certain way because of what or because of what happened. They might use action or role playing to show what happened, to show the issue that is bothering this particular individual. But when it comes to sexual abuse, the sexual abuse issue, some of their sign language may be graphic, or their body language may be graphic as well, but it's an identifier. It may prove like details, it's not enough details for a legal or a report about who the person is or who was the perpetrator. This can be used for a police report, but it doesn't entail all of the details. It's just more so to identify what it is that the deaf victim has gone through, and they would try to express it visually using props or action. Maryann?
Please.
I would just like to add in the explanation of expressing what happened to them, for those who have experienced language deprivation and have additional disabilities, their way of expressing what they experience may be very limited. As Laureen mentioned, they may engage in role playing. You may need to use props, no matter how old the deaf person is. If it's a deaf person that has additional disabilities, you may have to think creatively on how to help them be able to express what they experienced. Storytelling. And the other part is being open, just mentally and emotionally, in your heart and mind to really listen to the person in front of you and to really hear what they're saying and to receive them. And to really listen, not just to the interpreter, but listen with your heart to really, it takes a lot for them to be able to express it because it may have been years and years that they've held this inside. Or maybe it just happened. We don't always know. So just being open to listening. Laureen and I have both worked with the Deaf Catholic Youth Initiatives of the Americas with their encuentros. And the first time we've had young people, we trained them. They were not children, they were young adults. And we were training them for a week. And every time we have one of these encuentros, Laureen and I are usually very busy because this is the first time that many of these young folks have felt listened to, that they felt heard and seen. And they trust us. They develop a trust with us throughout the course of the week. And that has not happened to many of them in their lives. And so even though we use American Sign Language and they may use LSM, which is Mexican Sign Language, and we don't have the same language, but they know that we're listening to them and really listening to them, even if we don't share the same language. And both Laureen and I, we see how important that is for them. It doesn't matter the age, just being with another deaf person and also what their access to language has been up until that point.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask about the multilingual context that both of you have worked in, but you've already said something about that. And I'll just point out again how fortunate these young adults are to meet the two of you. But I'm thinking that institutionally, if one were to come to somebody in one's diocese or in whatever institution, what are the chances that you'd meet someone as sympathetic and patient and maybe even skilled for hearing the story of a deaf person who has been abused? So I can see that as an obstacle to reporting. I wonder. I think this came up a little bit in our conversation last week too, which is that, if I understood correctly, there are also some cultural factors within the deaf community that might lead someone to be hesitant to report, whether pressures or fears or something like that. I wondered if either of you could speak about that a little.
Yes. I'm trying to remember. Deaf people are considered under the realm of disabled to the eyes of a hearing individual. However, within the deaf community, we don't consider deafness as a disability, but rather there's a sense of belonging, there's a group, a shared experience of understanding, the shared experience of oppression within society. Now, the Hearing Society, if you will, there are a variety of ways to support one another. And within the deaf community, having that shared experience of oppression, neglect, lack of attention by their hearing peers who may think that, or who may not understand what we're doing from the hearing perspective. So hearing people may have more of a sense of taking care of a deaf individual, and they'll share it with another person. So that trust that you would think should be established is not entirely established or few and far between. So that disclosure, that sharing between the deaf and the hearing community is very few. There are deaf interpreters, but hearing family members may not know how to keep quiet or respect our privacy as well. So though the community is small, information is shared. So maybe a person may not feel comfortable reporting the things that have happened to them. They might think, well, who can I trust? I don't want the whole world to know what happened. Who may I report to? And not only that, but there's also a lack of accessible resources for the deaf person. They may not have resources to help them. For example, an interpreter may not be provided. Or how does a hearing person interact with a deaf person? What are the deaf issues that they experience? It's almost like being on an island. We don't know who to reach out to, or they might not know who to reach out to. Do you have anything to add, Maryann?
I think what Laureen said was spot on. There are just a number of barriers and things that would need to be removed in order to help with reporting, language, communication, access to both, lack of resources. Where do they go for assistance? Where are will interpreters being provided? You can't use a family member when interpreting
Yes.
or a friend for interpreting. You have to use a professional, skilled interpreter. If you can find a certified interpreter. In my area, certified interpreters are kind of few and far between. I'm in Kentucky. And so we don't have a lot of certified interpreters, but we look to find certified interpreters, professionally qualified interpreters that are not family members, not friends, to interpret. Also, education. Um, we still require a lot of education, and there's not a lot of education out there where to really understand what's happening and to understand what their knowledge of the world. So I just like to share some of those things. Society, there, of course, we all know there's biases, right? And there's a bias that, oh, deaf people can't do this, you can't do this. The mentality is can't. And so, and again, that goes along, oh, well, deaf people can't experience abuse. They can't experience this. So again, it those biases impact our understanding and awareness. Societies and deaf people that have experienced limited access to information also may not understand what's appropriate and not appropriate. As Laureen mentioned, confidentiality. Who can I trust? Who can I share this information with? Also, shame and guilt is so prevalent. Like, this happened to me. Maybe it was supposed to happen to me. Maybe I did something wrong, and so I'm a deaf person, so they've already inherently been thought of themselves as less than somebody else, less than a hearing person, and so that compiles. There's just so many layers to this. It's a very important topic because deaf and deaf-blind and deaf people with additional disabilities are indeed a forgotten group.
Thank you. Yeah, that's again very helpful. I'm going to pause for 1 second and remind everybody who's viewing that if you haven't done so already, but you would like to, please send your questions to Erin in the chat. It will say Erin, and the word questions will be next to her name. In about 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to start to take some of those questions, but now is the time to get them in there. Okay, some of us had the chance to view the recording of your presentation in Rome. And one of the things we often talk about in these courageous conversations is that obviously abuse happens not only to children, but also to adults. And in your video or in your presentation, you mentioned and you showed the ASL sign for vulnerable adults. And we wondered whether you could teach us that sign and then explain to us a little bit of what it means and how that came to be the sign, if you know something about that. So I don't know, maybe Laureen, this time you can begin.
I'll give this one to Maryann.
Oh, okay, so Maryann, yeah. I think I'm 0 for 3 on this. Yeah.
That's okay. We're a part of a team.
Yeah, good.
Yes, absolutely. Teamwork. So historically, the ASL sign for the word vulnerable used to be the sign for weak, a person who is weak. And through discussion, this happened within the deaf community. Through discussion, for those who have experienced domestic violence, for those who have experienced abuse, sexual assault, we had this discussion in the deaf community. Does that mean we're weak? No, it doesn't mean that I am a weak person because of this abuse. It means I was vulnerable, which means someone took away my power. So I'm using it a little bit more English to show you they grabbed my power, they took it away. So in ASL, we would sign the sign for power, and then this sign for like none. It's not there. It's non-existent. So somebody removed my power. It doesn't mean that I'm weak. It means that I've had my power removed. It means that they have they have beaten me in this regard. It doesn't mean that I'm weak. So that is a discussion within the deaf community and how that new sign came about. And there has, and Laureen can attest, there's been a lot of discussion about the word vulnerable. And what does that mean for hearing people as well? For in the Vatican offices, what does vulnerable mean? Not just within the deaf community, but just this is also a discussion within the hearing community to really understand what the word vulnerable means.
Hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I do think it's helpful to sometimes to come at things from different languages. It helps to understand uh, what the thing itself is, if you have different perspectives on it, or it can help. And I wondered, I mean, there may not be, but do any other signs, words like that come to mind in relation to abuse and vulnerability or concealment, where the deaf community has had conversations about what the proper sign is? And are there any other examples that we might learn from that you can think of?
Yes. Yes. One thing that comes to my mind is the word abuse.
Hmm.
There are several signs for the word abuse. It's not only one size fits all, because then you have to identify what is the meaning of that abuse. Was it physical? A physical violence, a physical abuse that took place? Was it sexual abuse? Sexual abuse would be a sign like this: to take advantage of someone. And then we have grooming, the abuse that takes place in grooming. Really, it depends on the context. It depends on the conversation, what is happening. So contextually, that sign would need to be clarified, to relate to this particular type of abuse that occurred. So for that reason, we have different signs depending on the context of the abuse. That is the one thing that comes to my mind to your question.
Hmm.
Maryann, I believe, may have another.
Please.
Just to add, sexual abuse, um, the English word so the sign it's not really what it means in English. So the sign they use is like for sex, and then the sign is to take advantage of. So take advantage of somebody sexually. So when we sign sexual abuse, we're maybe thinking of the English words, but that's not exactly what happens to a person when they experience sexually abuse. They are taking advantage of it, but there's more than that. The person was taken advantage of. So the sign itself um, becomes it, but it's the English words that have really influenced the signs that have been used. So the sign in case of sexual abuse is being taken advantage of sexually. So thank you for Laureen, and I agree. Grooming um, is a type of abuse because this sign for physical abuse looks like a person being beat, like physically hit. Also, within the last, I would say recently, within the last 15 years, there's been research regarding communication abuse.
Verbal abuse, yes.
Yes. And so in sign, we do sign communication abuse as in physical abuse versus to take advantage of communication.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a really rich conversation to be had then about the ways we're expressing these terms. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Oh, go ahead, Laureen.
Okay. I would like to add, in the future, if any of you were to interact with a deaf person who has experienced abuse in the past, any type of abuse, provide an interpreter. Interpreters are trained to speak or sign and interpret to their highest capability, but there may be some areas that may be unfamiliar or uncomfortable for the interpreter, such as a topic of abuse. So double check with the interpreter that they know what the context is that they will be interpreting, and to make sure that they are truly interpreting what it is the deaf person is expressing. Sometimes a deaf person may express something, but the hearing person may beat around the bush about it. So make sure that that information is there, that the interpreter understands what the deaf person is expressing. It's not a critique on interpreters. They're doing their best, but sometimes in some areas, we may have to double check if those interpreters may not understand a particular deaf individual because of issues with language. It may best then be to call a deaf interpreter who is trained in interpreting processes, not a family member, not a friend. No, it must be an interpreter, a certified deaf interpreter or an interpreter, to pick up the deaf person's language and be able to express it clearly and the process of their language. The nuances. They must be able to pick up the nuances of language to make that voice interpreting smooth and easy to facilitate that communication, making sure that our deaf survivors, our deaf victims, may express detailed information without any additional confusion or distortion in communication. In the court system, in trials, there have been many miscommunications that have happened between the deaf victim and the interpreter and the courts and the judge. And we have to make sure that all of these things are set into place for the clearest communication. If a hearing interpreter is able to understand a deaf person, such as myself or Maryann, who are assigning, great. But if the deaf person has limited language, ordinary hearing interpreters are not trained for that. So you would have to bring in a deaf interpreter to help facilitate that communication access. And that's all I'll say on this topic.
That's terrific. Go ahead, please, Maryann.
Just to add about interpreters, if you're working with a deaf person or a deaf blind person or a person with additional disability and you need to call an interpreter, and contact an interpreter agency. When you do so, please notify them that the situation may include sexual abuse or other types of abuse. And the reason to disclose that is because interpreters may have experienced abuse themselves. And so if they're called by an agency or contracted with an agency and an interpreter comes in, the agency needs to notify the interpreter, because the interpreter would not maybe select to go to that assignment if it may be triggering for them. So a lot of people have experienced abuse of all sorts, sexual abuse. So we want to be mindful and respectful of the interpreters as well.
Excellent. And actually, you've led me into the final question before we take some audience questions, which was to ask whether there are some practical things you would suggest to hearing Catholics who want to help prevent abuse among deaf Catholics, or when it occurs, unfortunately, hearing Catholics who want to be allies and want to help deaf Catholics safely to report. So it sounds like number one, find a qualified interpreter is a major piece of that. And but I don't know, are there one or two other things that you might leave us with before we turn to audience questions? Maybe Maryann, you could start if there's one on your mind. If not, Laureen. Yeah.
First, I think when you're faced with this situation, um, finding an interpreter may be one challenge, and convincing a diocese or a parish to pay for that professional service as an interpreter. That has been my experience working with a variety of different dioceses, is convincing them that it is a service that they have to pay for, and to not use a family member or a friend as an interpreter. Secondly, I think um, don't wait for someone to come and disclose. Do your homework. Again, of course, you know I'm a professor, so I'm a teacher, so I like to educate. But know where your interpreter agencies are in your local area. Have them ready. So then, if somebody does disclose to you, you know where to go, and you're not scrambling. Maybe know be in touch with Catholic Charities or other offices where individuals are seeking assistance from the church and may end up disclosing in one of those places. So do your homework and try to be ready, so that if it happens, you're not kind of panicking like, oh no, now what do I do? How do I get an interpreter? Just be prepared, so you have the tools ready to act if someone does come to disclose. Also, if a person, is trying to disclose, but they're not sure about communication, there are apps on the phone. There's several apps that can be downloaded that can change, even spoken English to some signs. So again, do your homework. I'm sorry, I'm giving you homework. That's probably the last thing you all wanted today.
We are near the end of the semester, so a little more homework is okay. Yeah. Okay, that's terrific. Laureen, would you like to add anything before I read some? Okay, great. Okay, then let's go to
No,
the.
she covered all the bases. The best way to communicate is through phone, computer, providing an interpreter, knowing basic signs of communication, such as hi, welcome to church.
Hmm,
She covered the bases. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple of our audience members have asked particularly around questions around prevention. And so here's one version of that question. What should we in the Catholic Church incorporate into our Virtus training? That's VIRTUS, or other safeguarding trainings, particularly for protecting deaf or deaf-blind children and vulnerable adults in order to remain vigilant about preventing abuse. Do you have any recommendations or criticisms?
So for the Virtus training, I hope that they would include a lot of videos, captioned videos, so that deaf individuals themselves can take that training. So making sure those videos are captioned, perhaps providing signed communication for those trainings as well. All the information of deaf, deaf-blind, deaf with other disabilities, all of that information. It would depend on how Virtus trains their people online to set up some sort of format to bring together people how to become task force, to train people how to work with deaf, blind, and deaf with other disabilities individuals.
Okay, thank you. Please, Maryann.
Yeah, just to add, to connect with what Laureen was saying, I think it's very important to have captioning on videos, but additionally to really encourage, and I would say push our diocese to have it signed, have an interpreter in a bubble, or it's in ASL in the bubble. Because remember, captioning is going to be an English word order. And as I mentioned, we also know that captioning is not always 100% accurate, especially if it's speech recognition captioning. So I was sitting in a church, and we didn't have an interpreter, and I put on the live transcribe on my phone so I could read along for the homily. I had the readings, of course, in the missal. And so I was looking at the live transcribe during the homily, and I was like, some of this doesn't make sense. It said spanky came up on the transcription, and I'm like, did the priest really say spanky in his homily? That doesn't sound quite accurate. So the apps are okay, but they're not ideal. I would say I would just encourage, or again, push our diocese to have captioning, but also have it available in sign language. And train our employees, because many people are not necessarily motivated, but you have to read through the Virtus training. So my diocese is working to change it to be safe. Our safeguarding videos are captioned right now for training. A safe parish is what they're transitioning to. But again, we don't have it visible in ASL yet. But hopefully that's a recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Another question that has come up from a couple of people is we are intrigued, some of the audience members are intrigued by the fact that only 30% of parents of deaf children use ASL. And a very general question, why is the adoption of ASL so low? Do you think is it particularly difficult to learn? And are there efforts being made to improve, access or training for parents, for families, et cetera?
Maryann.
You're right. Really, the numbers are below 30%. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is ASL is in fact a language. You have to you can't just take a couple of classes and become fluent. Secondly, parents sometimes think, well, my kid can probably lip read, so we'll do that. That'll be sufficient, which is also untrue. And if we do a cochlear implant, either in one ear or both ears, then they feel like, well, they're becoming hearing like. They're really not hearing. But, and parents, I'm not trying to abuse parents. Parents have a lot on their plates. However, I do wish that more parents would sign and communicate with their children. I work at a Catholic deaf school, and we have become more like the parents. Of course, you cannot replace parents, but we do have students that come to us and tell us what's happening in their lives, what they're dreaming about, what their fears are, what their hopes are for the future, because communication doesn't happen at their home, but it happens at the school. So parents starting to learn sign language, it can be tough for sure. Also, parents, I think, well, my kids understand me. And parents think that because whether they have hearing aids or they have a cochlear implant and they can hear me, but we don't really know how much they can hear and understand. And so parents don't sign as a result. Does that answer your question?
It seems like it does. Laureen, would you like to add something?
I would like to add to that. Yes, absolutely right on all counts. When a baby is born and the doctor or the parents find out that the child is deaf, who do they go to? They turn to the medical staff or an audiologist. And their view is a medical perspective on deafness. So they may say, oh, this child needs a cochlear implant. Oh, this is what you have to do. You have to fix, without exploring different options. If someone in the area does not have resources for them to understand or become familiar with deaf community or deaf culture, which is often not the case, then the medical staff makes that decision without exploring other possibilities such as sign language, immersion in the deaf community, schools for the deaf. So it really does depend on where. I know nowadays with social media and a wider exposure to other options, still though, I would say the automatic response is for nurses or doctors to recommend something else other than the deaf community and the people.
Please, Maryann.
Just to add to what Laureen said, typically when a child is born deaf, not always, but typically, our nurses, our doctors will both say, oh, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry. Your baby is deaf. It automatically sets up a negative connotation about their child. Their child is deaf, and I feel sorry for you. This is something to be sorry about. As Laureen said, um, this I wish doctors, especially as a deaf person, I wish doctors and medical professionals would see the child as a whole person and provide a range of options to parents and families so that parents and families can be well informed in making a decision about what course of action to pursue with their child. Um, having a deaf person or having somebody in the field having access to information or ASL, but not just the pathological view, the medical model, pathological model of something is broken, needs to be fixed.
Thanks, Maryann. That's a good reminder to all of us. I think this will be our last question before we do the concluding remarks. And here it goes. I wondered, this would be to either of you, but maybe Laureen, I'll try again. If you would maybe begin. Have you noticed, what do you think about efforts to train more ASL interpreters in the Catholic Church in particular? Is it happening? Do you have hope in that regard? Are you feeling despair in that regard? Is there growing awareness of the needs of and the special circumstances of deaf Catholics and so on? Could you say something about that?
Yes, I would like to see more sign language interpreters within the Catholic Church. It's a challenge to find interpreters who feel comfortable in a Catholic setting, in the Catholic Church. We all know that many people, not only interpreters, but in general, we have less people attending Catholic masses, Catholic churches, not only within the Catholic Church, but other churches as well. The numbers have dwindled. Now, some people may feel a very strong sense of belonging within the Catholic Church, and they may feel like willing to interpret for their Catholic Church. Some interpreters may not be comfortable with religious sign language interpreting. They might be unfamiliar with the terms. They would prefer perhaps like the day-to-day interpreting. For example, science. You have a science class or a different science terminology, and they may be familiar with that, but that's not our day-to-day conversation that we're talking about. That's just one area of interpreting. So in a like manner, church or the Catholic Church context may be one particular area of interpreting. So we would like to provide training to sign language interpreters to be more comfortable and familiar with interpreting in a Catholic context, especially the terminology within the church. It is possible for one to gain familiarity with it. There are not many sign language interpreters who will interpret within a church to provide access to growing our faith.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Maryann, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think training is also an obstacle. Where do interpreters go to get trained? Interpreting within the Catholic Church, our interpreters need to be trained. If you graduate from an interpreter training program, they're not necessarily trained to work in our in the area of the Catholic Church with our terminology and our masses. So or maybe they go to church. That's great as well. But outreach services for deaf people, where are those things happening? And try to work with deaf people and encourage them to come back to the church and come to church. So interpreters also have to be trained, but also we need to invite the deaf community to be involved and to help form their faith.
I would like to add to that. Within deaf ministries within the United States, there are some, mine, there's one in Milwaukee, Texas has one, Houston, I think, Fort Worth, San Antonio, California. They have tried to set up a training offered to interpreters to learn more about Catholic terminology, Catholic sign language in Catholic settings, rituals, facets, festivities. They've tried to provide these. We've done this, but since the community has gotten smaller, and I guess we're not finding these deaf people to continue with the growth and the consistency, retaining this deaf population. There is a lot of work to do in that regard.
Okay, well, those are really helpful comments. And before I turn it over to my teammates for some concluding remarks and your final question, I just want to say what a privilege it's been for me to moderate this conversation. I just have found it enormously illuminating. I've really learned a lot from both of you, Maryann and Laureen, and I want to thank you very much for being here with us today. And I don't mind having a little homework. I appreciate that. And I also want to thank Sue and Lizzie for their impeccable job of interpreting today. It's really been it's been a gift to be part of this. So thank you very much. And I think I turn it over to Catherine now.
Hey everyone, thank you. My name is Catherine Hours, and I'm Awake's Community Engagement Specialist. And I'd like to offer a sincere thanks to both of our speakers, to Christian as our moderator, and to all of the attendees for making time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. One of our goals with Courageous Conversation is to inspire personal action. And so I'll invite our panelists back in a moment to share some closing thoughts about actions we each might consider taking. I do have a few announcements first. As we mentioned at the start of today's event, this is our final Courageous Conversation of the 2024-2025 season. We will take a break for the summer and we'll start planning our next season's events, which will begin again in the fall, and we will email you with details soon. Later today, we will send out a feedback survey, which includes registration for part 2 of this event, which will take place in 1 week on May 1st in the evening at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. It's a chance to break into small groups to discuss what we heard today. We will have ASL interpreter services available next week, as well as Zoom closed captioning. Please plan to join us if you're able. We'd also ask if you consider sharing the recording of today's event with your friends and your network. We will have the recording available on the Awake website and our YouTube channel in the next few days. And now we'll return to our panelists for some final thoughts. What final message would you like to offer to all of us here today about making the church safer for Catholics who are deaf? Laureen, can we start with you?
I would ask the Catholic Church to welcome those who are deaf to be involved within the church. Find a way to communicate with them. If there's no interpreter nearby, find a way to get them included, to include them. Maybe there'll be information about accessibility that you can look into, or other ways to communicate to help them feel included and a part of your Catholic Church community, to build relationship with them, hoping that they'll approach lay people. Hopefully they'll be able themselves to ask for help. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Maryann, what would you like to offer?
I would piggyback, yes, being welcome, but also providing an invitation. Invite someone, invite the deaf people to come together with you, invite an interpreter to be together. Maybe it's just a few people just being together. I think it's important for you, but it's also important for the deaf individuals to work together for the future, for all people within our church. And then just be open your mind, open your heart to learning. Laureen and I were very privileged and honored to be asked to be a part of this conversation today. But we just encourage you to never stop learning. Those who are deaf, blind, those who have different disabilities, we always have something to learn. Especially this community is often called the invisible community because you can't see deafness. Of course, you can see if somebody's signing, but you can pass by somebody on the street and you may not know that they're deaf. So reach out and invite them to be visible.
Thank you so much. And now I'll share that the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. And when we gather, we pray together. So we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay to join us in our prayer. We know that there are good reasons that some may not choose to stay. And if you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and we hope to see you again soon. And now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, we're in the presence of God who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that learning from one another, as we did today, is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for for bringing us together this afternoon and giving us the sacred gifts of community and the wisdom that we heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen. Thank you to all of you for joining today. Go in peace. Take care. Goodbye.